I am Dracula.
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. This is the beginning of a third series. We've explored the figure of the witch and the monstrous feminine, and we're going to be spending the next few months talking about the most elegant of movie monsters, the vampire. In each episode, I'll be joined by a special guest to dive deep into a vampire movie or two, or in the case of this episode, 3. Because to kick off this season, I'm joined by vampire expert, author, scholar, and founding member of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies, Dr. Sirka Nieline, to talk about probably the most iconic vampire in fiction and in horror cinema. I'm talking, of course, about Count Dracula. We're going to be diving into 3 very different screen adaptations of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The original screen Count, played by Bela Lugosi in the 1931 film, the iconic Hammer horror film from 1958 where Sir Christopher Lee took on the Bloody Mantle and Peter Cushing played his nemesis, the vampire hunter Van Helsing, and a lesser known, but absolutely wild, 1979 film starring Frank Langella's Dracula with Laurence Olivier as an aging Van Helsing, which presents the undead Count as an erotic, seductive figure. If you're new to the podcast and it was the gifts of Frank Langella's Buffon that drew you in, please know that we do discuss the films in detail from pretty much the very beginning. All the films we'll be talking about have very different takes on the Dracula story, so if you're not familiar with the source material or you haven't seen some of these films, the spoilers are light, but do feel free to jump ahead to the ones that you've seen if you don't want any details revealed to you at all. This season is made possible with the support of Arrow Video, who bring you the very best in cult, horror, and genre films, specializing in deluxe definitive home entertainment editions. Their collection now spans more than 500 physical releases, including films from Dario Argento, John Carpenter, Chan-wook Park, and many more. Throughout the season, we'll be recommending a film that we love from their vast collection. And this week, I'd highly recommend you check out Abel Ferrara's The King of New York, which stars Christopher Walken as drug lord Frank White, fresh out of jail and back on the streets of New York City. It'll be out on DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K UHD on November 16th. And for more information, you can head over to arrowfilms.com. If you enjoy this podcast or you're new to what we do, you can find out more about the Final Girls and all of our projects over on thefinalgirls.co.uk. And with that, enjoy our triple bill of Dracula chat. Circa, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for making the time to join me.
Thank you for having me, Anna.
It's a pleasure. And as we were talking before we started recording, it kind of materialized in a wonderful way where I was thinking about emailing you and you were thinking about emailing me about something else. And here we are remotely recording.
This is it. And when you mentioned vampires, I could not resist.
And who better to kick off this new series of the podcast than with you? So we have got a lot of films to get through in this episode, but I want to start off just asking you about what is your own relationship with the vampire? And I'm talking obviously in fiction, but you know, I don't know.
I'd never give away trade secrets, would I? My relationship with vampirism is long and winding, but to kind of boil it down to its pertinent moments, I suppose, I fell in love with vampire fiction when I was a teenager, quite a young teenager, and it was just before Into the Vampire had come out in the mid-1990s. And what got me really excited was, of course, the vampire's story or the vampire's point of view. So I read Into the Vampire, I instantly ran out and bought tons more of the fiction, read Dracula, read lots and lots of different types of vampire fiction, discovered there was a whole world of fiction that did appeal to me quite strongly. And of course then, very much familiarized myself with the cinema of it, and I've been coming back to it ever since, and that's a few decades ago now. I went to do different studies. I undertook different degrees, and then I kept on having the pull of the vampire fiction and film coming back to me. So I ended up writing my doctorate on vampire fiction and film. And now I teach history of vampires, amongst many other things, at the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies at MMU. So for me, it's been a lifelong love affair with the undead that has materialised in these really wonderful opportunities.
I love it. And also, I genuinely would have totally gone to study the history of vampirism if that had been available to me when I was studying.
You're always welcome. We have it at all levels, so you're always welcome. Anyone who wants the history of vampires, you can always come along.
Oh my God, don't tempt me because I will. I will. So, and can you talk a little bit about what is it about vampirism and vampirism fiction that appeal to you?
Well, you see, they're the most elegant of all monsters, I think, or creatures or others, whichever way you look at them. They are the most elegant. I mean, the ghost is spectral. The ghost is oftentimes, something to be feared or misunderstood or stuck in a loop of its own kind. The zombie is rotting flesh, abjection, unpleasant in some respects, however sympathetic they might be portrayed. But vampires are quite unique. They're kind of like time travelers, is the way I've always kind of thought of them. That they are a product of their own time, but they are timeless as well. So they're contradictory. They're up to date with a vengeance, as Jonathan Harker describes Dracula in the novel, but at the same time they represent a past that is dislocated. So I've always been fascinated by that they can occupy two times or two worlds simultaneously, and they bring with them all the history of their experience and their age. So I find them really fascinating because they do all that, and on top of that, they're usually, especially in the last maybe 60 years of popular culture at least, they're very attractive, they're very seductive. A little bit of blood drinking aside, perhaps, they tend to have a very persuasive worldview. Certainly the ones who are romantic and tragic as opposed to despotic. But I really appreciate that about them. They just have a different way of living. And as I say, a bit like time travelers, they're dislocated. So there's always some interesting collision course that they're on when we look at their narratives. So I just find them endlessly appealing and exciting.
You mentioned Dracula in there, and kind of moving on to specifically into probably the most famous vampire in all of fiction, Count Dracula. So who is Dracula? For anyone who might not be familiar with the novel and the story of the Count, despite him being everywhere, or maybe because he is everywhere.
I think sometimes because he is everywhere and has been adapted so many times on stage, screen, in every possible capacity in media, that people forget the original version of him, or he gets lost in translation at that point. So the interesting thing about Dracula is that he is a count. He is in Transylvania, and he is planning to move to England to basically take ownership of properties that he has secured. So he's moving from the east, from Transylvania, and at that time when Stoker wrote the novel, that was a very distant, far off, unruly, strange place. It's not the place that we know today as modern Romania. So as a result, we find that he is someone who is completely outside any sort of sphere of influence in Western Europe. And he's coming to England in order to essentially exert his influence further. And what's interesting about that is that he's rather unknowable, and that's what makes him so exciting. So in the novel, we have all these various points of view in the novel, from diary entries, from stories from different characters talking about when they encounter him and how strange and fascinating he is. But what's really interesting about it is that two things. Number one, everyone who talks about him in a slightly different way. That, he's either weird and strange, as Jonathan Harker observes, or that there's something maybe seductive and terrifying about him, as Mina says, or indeed that he's going to promise eternal life, as Renfield keeps saying. But what's really interesting is we never get Dracula's perspective at all. There's no humanizing element to Dracula. So as a result, he's unknowable. His voice is not in the novel, even though the novel bears his name. And as a result, I think we've spent the entire 20th century filling in that gap. Who do we think Dracula is? What does he mean to us? How do we conceptualize him in a modern sense? So this is why I think we have so many Dracula film adaptations and novel extensions and reimaginings of him. But he becomes this sort of central character that we think we know, but he's always adapting and changing with the times.
I think that's a beautiful point to move into the first authorized screen adaptation of Dracula. which is Todd Browning's 1931 film.
I am Dracula. A moment ago, I stumbled upon a most amazing phenomenon. Something so incredible, I mistrust my own judgment. Look.
Dracula. The very mention of the name brings to mind things so evil, so fantastic, so degrading. You wonder if it isn't all a dream, a nightmare.
Rats. Rats. Thousands. Millions of them.
But no, this is no dream. This is Dracula, the original terrifying story of a maniac and a man who lived after death, lived on human blood, took the form of a vampire bat, and lured innocent girls to a fate truly worse than death.
Dracula? Oh, what's he done to you, dear? Tell me.
He came to me. He opened a vein in his arm, and he made me drink.
Let's dive into the first screen Dracula. And I mentioned the fact that this is the first authorized version or the first authorized adaptation because there was Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922, but that was a sort of bootleg version of Dracula. So this is the first big screen count. So where does Dracula from 1931 come into the history of horror films?
So it comes in at a very interesting time. Dracula, as you say, there was an unofficial, an unauthorized version by Murnau in 22, which resulted in lawsuits, and we very nearly lost it entirely to basically a writ of destruction of the reels. So what happens is Dracula then, because it was adapted as a stage play as well, Stoker had overseen this, it takes on this life in the 1920s on Broadway. So we have two versions. We have the Balderston version and the Dean version. And those are kind of hybridized in the 1920s. They're hybridized in such a way that by the time we get to the 1930s Universal film, 1931 film, what we have is this really interesting development or snowballing from the theatrical decisions and the theatrical staging and costuming of Dracula, that and casting, of course, of Lugosi, and how this comes into effect when we make this, when we see it in the 1931 film. So all of these decisions that have kind of snowballed throughout the 1920s ends up informing the visual sumptuous nature of the 1931 film by Browning. It also introduces us to Bela Lugosi, who is very dashing, very seductive, brings about these iconic characteristics in that portrayal. Thinking about Dracula as heavily accented, thinking about him as someone who has this really deep, penetrative stare, the stare that seems to arrest time and hypnotize all who gaze upon him. The fact that he is an elegant man in very inelegant surroundings, and when you think of how he's captured on the staircase in Carfax Abbey. So there's so many dislocations and incongruities that come to the fore in this film that really emphasize just how exciting a character Dracula is, and also how iconic he would become, because of course this look and this image and this sound and this accent and Lugosi's own dynamic flair in playing the role, that becomes the template, that becomes the kind of benchmark of what Draculas will look like for a very long period of time thereafter.
Absolutely. And I'd love to dig into this a little bit, because it's interesting that you mentioned Nosferatu a little bit, but this template of the elegant vampire, the elegant monster, really starts with Bela Lugosi's performance, which I think kind of straddles both the silent film world and the beginning of the talkies, because he's very much acting with his face, with his eyes, with his movements, even his stillness has such gravitas to it. Even now, I've watched this film a million times and rewatched it last night. I was still struck by how dominating he is on screen, even when he's doing the tiniest of movements. And when he finally speaks, it's almost, even if it's just a whisper, it almost feels like a scream. And I love to talk about his approach to this Dracula, which is a role that he played on stage, didn't he, before?
Yes, he was on Broadway before, and I agree with you about that idea that we're waiting for him to speak, and the silence before he speaks makes it all the more threatening, and at the same time makes it all the more exciting when he does eventually deliver, whether it is a sigh or a cutting sort of comment. It is something that we are waiting for, and I think that's also about the production as well, about the introduction of sound and the difference that the performance would ask of Lugosi. It's a different way to physically explore the Count on the Broadway stage than it is on screen.
Mm-hmm.
It of course transitions the technology, but at the same time it also makes Lugosi a very different kind of star after he's in Dracula. It associates him much more with the Gothic archetypes that we grow to know as the universal monsters of the 1930s. He's very much central to that, himself and Karloff. So it's quite a powerful moment, I think, in production, as much as it is about thinking about how to capture something so Gothic and iconic. In this new mode of horror filmmaking in the 1930s. It's really exciting.
And there is an interesting parallel between Lugosi as an actor and his position in Hollywood at that time and with Dracula. And I'm thinking specifically of the heavy accent and the fact that, well, Lugosi himself is an immigrant in the States, and he's portraying this dashing, exotic, appealing, but still, foreign seductor, basically. And I think that very much became a part of his own public persona in Hollywood.
Yeah, from what I understand, he had many a sort of a decadent afterlife, I suppose, if you way kind of put it. There was a kind of decadence associated with his personal life, I think, afterwards as well. So from what I recall, of reading around him, he had multiple marriages, had many great love affairs, it was said. So I think there's something about the persona and the actor brushing up against one another. I also think as well, because his accent does announce his foreignness. I think rather than seeing Lugosi as someone who's putting on an accent to heavily to connote Dracula's difference, he doesn't need to do that. It's very much part of the owning the fact that of his foreignness. He's not about to ingratiate himself or disguise himself in English culture. He knows about English culture, but that does not mean at any point that he wishes to go native in the culture. So I think that makes it very interesting. His difference marks him out as exotic and exciting and attractive, as opposed to something that is to be refined out of him. He's in no way going to give into that. I mean, as nearly all Dracula adaptations that try to be faithful to the novel one way or the other say, they always have that speech where they say, we have the right to be proud of who we are. And this is something that Lugosi's performance states, I think, quite clearly.
Absolutely. And I think kind of even subtle might not be the word, but I think it states it very clearly in his choice of accent or his voice, because in the two films that we're going to discuss after this one, the other two key adaptations of Dracula, they all adopt a fairly English or even Americanized accent.
Yes, that's true. I think Lugosi's performance is, I think there are others who have tried to bring in an accent in order to kind of give it a legitimacy. I think Coppola's Dracula, in that, Gary Oldman is certainly trying to channel a Lugosian style accent, but he doesn't do it as pronounced. But I think that, when you're looking at the two other immediate ones that come after this, whether it's Terence Fisher's film or indeed John Badham's, those two versions of Dracula are very much in response to the media expectation around that character. And that all again stems back to Lugosi's own iconic branding of what we think Dracula should sound and look like. Because up until that point, you have a silent film like Nosferatu, where Orlok looks so different and acts so profoundly frightening, but of course in a silent manner. And then until that, you only have stage productions and, of course, the novel itself. So to give voice to Dracula, to personify him and give him that space on screen to own the title, I am Dracula, I think that is something that can only be pulled off with a certain level of gravitas, and therefore becomes the benchmark for anyone thereafter who is going to at least try and lay claim to the title.
I love that. And also it's such a statement, and it's the first sentence we hear him utter in the film.
Yeah.
And what do you think then has been the influence of Bela Lugosi's Dracula since this film?
I think so much of it comes down to, well, there's the seductor and the stare. I think the stare is very much a Lugosi trademark. I don't think anyone else has pulled it off to the same degree at all. But I think if we're thinking about it in the grander scheme of popular culture, Lugosi's look, the style, the tuxedo, the widow's peak, the voice, all of this becomes a sort of package deal where you can literally, we just had Halloween, you could dress a child up in that outfit and they'd know it's not only Dracula, but it's Lugosi's Dracula. And that would be to someone who wouldn't necessarily know that there are 300 plus Dracula films in the world. This is the iconic one in terms of style and dress and substance in that sense. But I think as well as that we think of the parodies of vampires as well. We think of the lovely Count Von Count from Sesame Street. He is Lugosi in Muppet form, which is just the most adorable thing. And it just shows you that it transcends terror into something that's actually very knowable, quite safe, lovable, certainly. But it's such an iconic branding of the character, and at such an important time, not only in culture in the States, post the crash of 29, where these monsters are relief and are played to as iconic kind of images that around a very particular stressful time in the American imaginary. But equally, we also have these really important moments of catharsis where the monster is something, terrifying, but also very beautiful and very unknowable and mysterious and dare I say sexy. And therefore there's an attraction there. It's something that it becomes important to that generation and those kinds of horror films. And therefore it has a legacy that stands the test of time.
And do you know what was the effect that it had upon its release?
I do know that there was fainting, that there were women who, and I often wonder when I read about people fainting in films, is it more to do with it's so transgressive, there's a joy in that, like a rapturous fainting in the sense of too much desire, rather than necessarily any kind of terror. So I always think that Lugosi was a pin-up of his day, and very distinctive, very attractive looking man. So I wonder if there was this idea of, not only is he foreign, wealthy, certainly new to these shores, but also there's something very, very sexy about the fact that there's a new type of suave, aristocratic, immortal man on the scene. There's something very, very enticing about that. This is why vampires endure in ways that other monsters just do not enjoy the same level of legacy. But even Frankenstein has never enjoyed the full adaptability or the gamut that vampires have, in particular Dracula.
I love having now this vision in my head of women fainting going to see Dracula in the 1930s because Bela Lugosi was just too hot for the screen.
Too smouldering for the screen. But you have to admit, most of us fell in love with a vampire when we were young enough, without being able to articulate it perhaps, but it was there.
I mean, I rewatched this film for the nth time last night, and I still giggled when he did the "I don't drink wine" line.
Yes.
The power remains even now.
It really does. It really does.
And do you think kind of you brought up the kind of the Muppet version of Dracula and these iconic visual elements that created the blueprint for what we imagined the vampire and specifically Dracula would look like on screen with Bela Lugosi's performance and his take on it. Do you think with with that being so recognizable, but maybe even by people who may have not seen the original film, do you think there's an element of that vision of the elegant foreign Count Dracula that has been sort of cheapened by it being so replicated?
I mean, I should have supposed to give the caveat that he's not necessarily the first vampire that's an aristocrat. That would go back much earlier to John Polidori's,
Oh, yeah.
Lord Ruthven.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that kind of prototype in the ether in the literature. By the time we get to the film versions, I think that the Count in sort of elegant dress, that very much was a product of a staging decision on Broadway. So, that's absolutely fine. The cape, the tuxedo. And I suppose when we see that in later adaptations or reimaginings, unless it's handled well, it just looks like a parody. It has to be handled well. I mean, in the 30s, that would not have looked as, wouldn't have looked completely out of place. Whereas I think when you look at the Coppola version, which you get to later in 92, what you find is that, the Count, Oldman's Count is again dressed in elegant clothes, especially when he's in the London sequence. And he is very much a style that incorporates what is imagined to look like the clothing of that period. So you can see it from a 90s imagination, what this would look like. It doesn't look as staid or as perhaps prescribed as the 30s version, where the tuxedo is far more commonplace in sort of our the excesses of culture or the excesses of societal life. In the 90s, it looks like it is looking back on what we imagine those clothes look like and how to fuse the Count's own elegance with a more traditional dress of the 1890s. What I'm trying to say is that the 1930s version doesn't necessarily look as out of place, but when you try and replicate it, if you're not careful, it looks like parody.
Before we move on to the next kind of big famous iteration of Dracula, do you think the 1931 version stands up today? Do you think it's a horror film that fans or people who are interested in vampires and Dracula or in horror should visit?
Yes, I think it's a must watch. I think it's more important now, perhaps, as a testament to the power of cinema, the importance of the Universal Monster movement, the fact that Dracula has a very interesting, adaptable legacy throughout cinema, and therefore it's very important for that reason. It's kind of important to know the fountainhead of it in the kind of American imagination. But in terms of horror, no, I don't think it's necessarily anything to be afraid of. I do think that it's very gentle in many ways. It's strange. It's got some great moments in it that are very odd. But I think that it's something that for the sake of completism and certainly for the sake of knowing where these ideas have originated from and that they are always being recycled in later versions, one way or the other, there is a recycling of these images, then I think it's important for that reason to kind of know where it comes from.
So let's move on now to The Horror of Dracula from 1958.
This is the story of Dracula, a creature who destroys all whom he touches. Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night to inflict his terror upon the innocent and the unsuspecting.
Oh, you must help me. You must. You're my only hope. You must.
I'll help you. I promise. Please try and understand. This is not Lucy, the sister you loved. It's only a shell, possessed and corrupted by the evil of Dracula.
How do you destroy a fiend who has so far proven himself indestructible? Those who come to end his reign of terror stay to become his victims.
So I call this film The Horror of Dracula, even though it was just titled Dracula, because otherwise we're just going to have 3 films during the course of this episode called Dracula. It's going to get real confusing really quickly.
Sure.
But this is the Hammer horror version of the novel. And it's directed by Terence Fisher and starring Sir Christopher Lee as the Count. this version changes quite a few things from the original novel, doesn't it?
Absolutely. As was Hammer's own wont, I suppose. What they did was they often boiled down a lot of the characters. They got rid of any of the what they deemed to be superfluous characters, the excess. They changed a lot of the design. I think a lot of these choices were made by budget constraint.
Yeah.
But they also changed their Dracula and of course, their Van Helsing. They're very different versions of them when you think of it and compare them side by side. They're very, very, very different. Very much more modernized, much less contained, I would argue.
So what do you think of Lee's take on Count Dracula?
I think he's brilliant. I think he's so exciting. He's definitely more terrifying. And it's a different form of terror. It's a real terror of the body in the sense that you think everything about all the stillness that Lugosi accomplishes in Browning's film is completely destroyed when we get to Lee's film, because Lee's portrayal is so physical. It's so domineering. He uses his height extraordinarily well in the film. You always feel he's imposing upon you. He's on top of you, and on top of that, it's that ability to move really, really, really suggestively. And what I mean by that is, for instance, when he's descending the stairs, he looks like he's floating.
Yes.
And it's just a brilliant movement on Lee's part, and obviously the use of the cape and costume. But he's abrupt. He's frightening. He has you on the back foot from the moment you meet him. And I think that makes you go, this isn't the elegant encounter I was expecting. This is much more ferocious and as I say, unpredictable. And I think there's something quite brilliant about that in this film. I think it works very, very well. It contains Lee's energy, but at the same time, it always puts you on a set of being quite unsettled by him, I think.
There's something really menacing about him from the very first moment, because you're right, it does seem like Christopher Lee was very, very big man. He was 6'5", but he moves so quietly like a cat. But then you know that at any given moment he can pounce and absolutely annihilate you. There's a much bigger threat of physical violence from him, I think, than there ever was from Lugosi's take on the character.
Absolutely. I mean, think of when he's tossing the bride around the room. That was absolutely unexpected. It shows you that there's a genuine sense of threat and menace, as you said. And I think that he's using the audiences, or playing upon their expectations of, you think you're going to get this quiet intrusion of a performance, but instead you're actually getting this very physical, very frightening, unpredictable and domineering sense of performance. That isn't to say that he is not elegant in his choices as an actor, and I think he's actually fantastic because he reads so well. He reads those expectations and of course turns them on their head. And I think pairing him up with someone like Peter Cushing, you absolutely have to give as much of a performance. You have to make it as large as you can, because Cushing does that too. So the two of them in a way are the perfect pairing, because there's so much frenetic energy and so much at play between the two of them at all times. They really are a wonderful match for each other on the screen. No one gets to dominate the other for very long.
Totally. And there is also an element that I found really well. I want to come back to this a lot later on in our conversation, but I found it interesting to know that Lee didn't watch any other screen adaptations or performances of the role until well into making several of the Dracula films that he did for Hammer. And he wanted to create his own interpretation based on the book. So I wanted to ask you, kind of, what elements do you think that he takes from the novel and the original text that he brings in that we hadn't seen before in previous adaptations of the story?
I think that I appreciate Lee's Puritanism in that sense, I suppose. I mean, he was I was in Trinity College Dublin when I did my PhD there, and when I was there following that in my postdoctoral years, Lee was awarded the Medal of Dracula. Bram Stoker Medal, and he'd come to the university to talk about this, and he was very reverential about the text and very considered about the text. So I always thought, well, this is someone who's treated it as a piece of scholarship, and I think that that's really important to, especially to someone like me, because I treat these texts as quite valuable and important. So what he pulls from Dracula, I think, is this idea that Dracula is physical, and not just physical in terms of being embodied, but he can be everywhere. So he can transform himself, he can influence people, he can seduce, but at the same time he is terrifying. And what he does is he manages to capture this through small gestures, and the way he looks at women, or indeed the way he, gets you on the back foot with a particular way of delivering a line. But also he knows that he's embodying this huge character and culture, even by the 50s. And therefore he has to rise to the occasion by making himself big, or making himself stated in a particular way that he has the authority to say the line, just as much as Lugosi did, I am Dracula. But the way the two of them deliver it is really telling in the difference of their performance, where Lugosi draws it out for effect, but also draws it out, emphasizes the language, emphasizes the accent. When you listen to the way Lee says it, he confirms it as though it's a business transaction. Yes, I am Dracula. And you're like, okay, that's really interesting, because there's no standing on occasion. So I already don't know what this guy is like. He's much more unpredictable than the Lugosi one, which is much more emphasizing the grandeur. Lee's one emphasizes the transactional nature of it all. And I think that's really interesting as an update.
And what do you think about the way that you mentioned it kind of a little bit before, the way he looks at women, the way that he physically handles the brides of Dracula and kind of the other female characters in the film? What do you make of that element of this adaptation?
It is a bit brutal in parts.
Yeah.
It's definitely uncomfortable viewing, in the sense that they are commodities, and I think that's what I was trying to get about the transactional nature. He treats all people as commodities to serve his greater goal. So as a result, women become, they are as disposable as pets, in the sense that they are there to be discarded, they're there to be tossed aside, they are in the way of glory, or they are obscuring the path to glory. So I think that as a result, he is always treating them as essential elements in the story, but never necessarily the end in itself. It never feels like a love story. It's very, very much like, as I say, treating them as commodities. So I think that shows you the film is really interested in getting him to face off with Van Helsing, because it's really about male on male power. It's not about female influence, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I was about to ask you kind of, do you think that his transactional approach to women is actually his transactional approach to all human beings, aside from Van Helsing, really?
Yes.
Or
yes, I would think so. Yes, I would think so. He's very singular in his image and his outlook. He's very singular.
Yeah, it doesn't, although there, I've read interviews with Sir Christopher Lee where he talked kind of about imbuing his take on Dracula with kind of an eroticism, but it doesn't quite feel erotic. It feels much more violent and like you say, just not to keep you overusing that word, but it does feel extremely transactional. Like, these are just bodies. I don't think even though there's no, I would hesitate maybe to give it a queer reading in this take, but I don't see him as really wanting women as much as just wanting bodies that he needs for sustenance.
Yes, and I think that the way to do that with the least minimal amount of fuss is the idea of the temporary seduction. It causes less disturbance, less likely to be found or caught out. I think that there is a coldness to his performance, a calculated coldness that some people find erotic because they associate it with power. Yeah. And that's fine. That's the way some people might choose to read it. And you go, okay. But there is no emotional depth. I think it's harder to fall in love with Christopher Lee's version of Dracula than it is to fall in love with Gary Oldman's version of Dracula.
Yes.
Or Frank Langella's version of Dracula. So there's varying states of, do you recognize him for his awe or his fantastical ability or wonder that you see with Lugosi, the physical rawness of the power you see with Christopher Lee, or the smouldering hypersexualized version of it that you get later on with Langella. So I think this is what I'm talking about, the adaptation or the immutability of vampires. They take on different traits according to the audience's tastes and desires. And I think in the 50s, this would have been a lot more frightening to watch an unpredictable, patriarchal, domineering, very cold, but certainly masculine in the full capital M word of it, encompassing Dracula, rather than someone that would be considered more foreign or effete or standing on ceremony as Lugosi does, or later ones which are much more sexually provocative.
Extremely alpha male vibes from Lee's performance here, but
yes.
I wanted to get actually into the one relationship that he does seem to care about and does want to fuss over as opposed to everyone else, and that's kind of his continuous antagonism with Van Helsing. What do you make of the way that this film pits them against one another?
I've always read it as a form of the old world versus the new, the kind of the proper version or the proper civilized kind of imagery of what it is like to be a man in control of his station and power and class. I've always read it that way, with the way that Cushing portrays Van Helsing. Sensible, absolutely. But increasingly deranged in order to control this folkloric intrusion into the rational world. So as Lee's performance becomes larger and becomes more terrifying as he's trying to vanquish Van Helsing, I think that equally so Van Helsing is his rationality and his propriety is pushed to the absolute limit. So it does feel a little bit like it's forgive me for saying it like this, but that sort of English propriety put to its absolute maximum test by this character who, in terms of his characterization at least, does not represent that. I think that Dracula is still an intrusion into that rational sensibility. So I've always felt that their heightened sense of play as they get to this sort of this final battle at the end, I've always felt that was always about giving it its all. It always feels like the two of them are really in the fight till the end. There's no backing off, there's no trickery, it's just physical demand of trying to control each other. I think that's what makes it quite exciting.
Yeah, and there is also a much scary, I mean, we sort of circled around this before, but we've mentioned a lot about kind of eroticism and kind of the vampire being a romantic lead. I love your linking it to the idea of a time traveler almost because of how it's shifted. But this version of Dracula is also bloody. Like he's covered in blood. He's got remnants of feeding on his face, on his fangs, on his hands. His eyes become bloodshot. It's very gruesome. So what do you think of kind of this injection of actual physical violence, of reminding ourselves very visually that Dracula is after all a monster?
I think it comes from two different places. The first is, again, going back to the technology. You have the explosion of Technicolor, and with Technicolor you get to show off different really lurid, gorgeous colors like the red blood. And I think that it is a horror film. It has been pitched as a horror film. It's been certainly designed and marketed as a horror film. So you have to have the payoff. And I think rather than making it look really neat and tidy, the drinking of blood, or something that's hidden away due to censorship or whatever, I think that by the 50s, you're like, no, I really want to see that there's actually a cost here, that there's actually some sort of violence that matters. And this is something that Hammer does with aplomb. Let's not beat around the bush. I think the other thing that you have as well, though, alongside this kind of Technicolor joy, is you have the physicality that comes into cinema and the destruction of bodies and the horrors. And that's pretty much coming out of the destruction of World War II. So when you have people coming back who are injured, maimed, the body horror, essentially the violence that people have witnessed and seen and the trauma under which they've gone, when you're going back to those safer, I say safer in inverted commas, but when you're going back to these safer fantasies, they can't remain completely divorced from the horrors of reality, because then they cease to work. So you have to include some sort of violence that has been bleeding across the cultural experience. So by making it much more visceral, or more visceral certainly at that time than it had been before, I think what you're doing is you're seeing that actually the world has changed and that people have undergone a trauma and that it has to update itself to serve the audience that are going to view it. So it is a horror film. It shows off the technology, but it still very much brings about this sense of violence and corporeality. The horrors that the body can be drained of blood, that there are actually these really, I think for the time, quite spectacular moments of violence, to show that there's something at stake here. There's something that matters at the core of this fantastical battle between the two. I just keep on thinking of his lurid bloodshot red eyes, which are just, I mean, if you imagine that, you know, in Technicolor in 1958, that must have just looked so terrifying.
That must have been an incredible scene to watch in
Yeah.
a cinema at that time.
I had heard a story from my late father who said that he had heard the story, so God only knows how true it is, but I don't mind because I think the best stories are always told third or fourth hand, where he used to go to see the films were screened in the Barbican, and that Lee used to sit at the back and there'd be a couple in front of him watching the films, and he used to lead forward and ask them for a light for his cigarette, and when they'd light the lighter they'd see it was him and freak out. And I don't know for a minute if it's true, but I love the image of that in my mind. That's just it fits perfectly, because then it shows, oh my God, he's real, he's in the cinema with us. There's something quite amazing about that. Yeah.
I love that. Oh no, I'm gonna choose to believe that is true.
Yeah, I love the idea of that, I have to say.
I mean, I've never met Sir Christopher Lee, although in my first job in London, I did once pick up the phone and it was him, and
Wow.
I just that voice, that voice just saying, "This is Sir Christopher Lee." I still remember to this day the fact that I was just not trembling, but absolutely stuck and moving at my desk and forgot how to use a phone or how to speak in that split second that he was talking.
It's wonderful. I mean, it's strange. When I saw him in Trinity, you know, what struck me was I knew he was tall, but it was very imposing. He was physically a very powerful man in the sense that you look at him, and even by then it was long after he had done Lord of the Rings, long after that. He still looked very imposing and tall and commanding. He had a tone in his voice that instantly commanded your attention and instantly commanded respect. And at the same time, wasn't necessarily severe. It was very seductive as well. It reeled you in. And I thought, yeah, that's the voice of someone who definitely could play, or who has played Dracula, because it's all about that authority, but the seduction of the story as well.
Let's move on now to the last Dracula adaptation that we're going to be discussing. I'm going to call it an erotic horror adaptation.
He has walked through centuries, untouched by time. He has seen empires rise and fall. He possesses the wisdom of the ages. Throughout eternity, no man has ever provoked such terrible fear and such haunting desire. Dracula, starring Frank Langella, with Laurence Olivier.
I am the last of my kind, descended from a conquering race, but I must warn you to take good care. If at any time my company does not please you, you will have only yourself to blame.
So this final take that we're going to be discussing in this episode is directed by John Badham and stars Frank Langella in the titular role. But it is arguably the least known version of Dracula out of the three that we have discussed today. Why do you think that is?
I think by the time this came out, so it came out in 1979, there was already 3 Draculas out that year.
Yeah.
And I think under the weight of these other versions that had come out, and of course Stan Dragotti's comedy Love at First Bite as well, which had come out as this wonderful parody, absolutely brilliant parody of 70s New York and Dracula having to fit into 70s New York and goes to Studio 54, stuff like that. Brilliant. You have this exhaustion that comes into the culture. think of the other film that comes out in 79 as well, of course, is Nosferatu the Vampire.
Yep.
And I think that when you look at how meditative and beautiful Herzog's film is, and then you compare it to Universal's 79 film, which serves a different palette altogether, I just think people felt just a bit drained by it at the time, because the 70s was such an incredible decade for vampires more generally, and even in Dracula adaptations specifically, you get so many different types, and then you get all these sort of subgenre offshoots. You know, you get Blackula, you have you know, Scream, Blackula, Scream. You have earlier again, you have Count Yorga, who's basically a slightly stranger version of Dracula in California. So you have these really interesting other types of vampires who are really, really great on their own terms, and I really love them for it. There's not a bad one amongst them. But then by the time you get to 79 and the Universal have finally decided they're going to make a luscious remake of this Dracula, you have to think to yourself, what are they trying to do that's different? Because they're still working on the same, you know, title property that they've had since 1931. They do some interesting things with it, though. They don't leave it go completely fallow or anything. But I think that it was a film that was in some ways compromised, and in other ways was made to service an audience that by that time had already gotten their kicks elsewhere. So, you know, I think there's a lot to unpack on this film, I think, to be perfectly honest. But what I like about it is that there is this weird little service to tradition as well, which is that Langella at the time, when he was cast, he was playing Dracula on Broadway. So we have that direct legacy back to Lugosi as well, which I think is wonderful. And I do know firsthand, a colleague of mine who used to teach in Trinity, she saw Langella on stage as Dracula, and she said the poor guy, when he was coming out to take his bows at the end of the night, he was getting knocked over by people not only throwing underwear, not only throwing bras, but throwing house keys at him, just losing their shit completely with him. Because, to be honest, you take one look at him and you go, of course I'm running away with you. Sod the Harker lot. Sod Sewards. I'm out of here. I'm running away with Dracula. And why wouldn't you? It's Frank Langella.
Listen,
You know?
I have to admit, I had not seen this film until today. I was always curious. I knew of its existence, and there's no way to intellectualize this. I mean, there are ways, but I'm not even going to attempt to. I absolutely lost my shit at this version of the Dracula story. I have only seen Frank Langella as an older, established, well-respected actor, a gentleman of the screen. I was not ready for this version of Frank Langella.
It's quite a, I mean, imagine if you saw that when you were about maybe, I don't know, 12 or 13. That would be some sexual awakening, you know?
I would have 100% got a restraining order against me by Frank Langella if I had seen him on stage.
I mean, the thing I love about Langella is he knows he's hot. Okay, I've read Langella's biography. He knows he's a good-looking guy. I mean, Langella's, by the way, I mean, you should read his biography is incredible in terms of Hollywood history. It's called Drop Names, and I mean, he has, you know, had relationships with Rita Hayworth. He has had relationships with innumerable stars, and, you know, been married and had extramarital affairs. I mean, the guy has just loved Hollywood, and it in turn has loved him, quite physically and quite literally. What I think was quite interesting about it, though, is that in playing Dracula, he knew full well he was going to play the sort of master seductor, and Badham knew this. Badham cultivated around this. I mean, he's surrounded by other great actors. Donald Pleasance certainly brings everything he's got to the role. Equally to Laurence Olivier, obviously in his older years, and I don't necessarily think the best use of Olivier, still tries his best, and it's in so doing, I think, is surrounded by other incredible actresses like Kate Nelligan. So I think we have this incredible energy of talent, and the film uses interesting ways of reversing, you know, it reverses colorization at points, so it makes daylight look like night shots, and that gives it an eerie sensibility. It has what can only be described as, I mean, even though he's got quite a huge haircut, by 70s standards it's very, very tidy. By contemporary standards you kind of go, seriously, you've got a bouffant, dude. But, you know, he really sells it as something like a forbidden sexual experience, and that's what makes it work. That's
Yes.
because it's treated seriously.
It is, they really lean into the erotic in this take on the story. I mean, it's the tagline of the film was a love story. It's very much presenting this take on Dracula as a romantic hero. And I emphasize the romantic, like he is a seductive. Even from the first moment we meet him, when he comes into the room, he just zeroes in on the women and instantly captivates them with just one look. And there's a difference, I think, between all of the other Draculas that we have discussed, is the fact that his attention is so intense and it translates so well onto the screen. And with Langella's performance, that when he sees a woman, he zeroes in, and the direction or the choice of framing as well kind of comes into this when there's nothing else that exists. And even I think it's quite comical when in that first scene when Dracula first comes into this soiree, someone has to pull away, essentially has to pull away his attention from the woman that he's talking to, because nothing else matters until he sees someone else.
That's right. No, he's and I think as well that that moment when he's talking to I think it's Lucy, and she grows faint with the penetrative stare. Essentially, you're kind of like, well, yeah. I mean, he is that overwhelming a presence. He really holds his own with everyone he's cast alongside. But equally, when he's looking at them, the camera, the cinematography really reinforces that. You feel like it's like he's staring through you when you're looking at him. And I think that's something, it's kind of like the way we describe love, isn't it? That they knew me, you know what I mean? They understood me, or they saw through me, and they saw into me. And I think that that's something that the film does very well in terms of that seduction, or being able to be unnerved by it. Of course, there's another big factor as well, is that, he's got these huge brown eyes that just melt you when you look at him. They absolutely melt you. I never realized how powerful that was until I'd seen this version, because other versions of Dracula tend to focus the sexuality on, whether it's the mouth or the orality of it, or indeed the costume or whatever, or the way that they physically hold themselves. He's all about essentially staring at these women, and in doing so he's very much going back to Lugosi on one level, but it's also updating Lugosi. It's not staring to the point of being creepy, it's staring to kind of get you to bare your soul. So it's something very erotic.
What do you think of the way that this Dracula updates those markers that I think kind of harken back a lot more to Lugosi than they do to Lee? The cape, the suaveness, the high society elements, the politeness almost to a comical effect, I think, considering that this is, a late 70s film.
Yeah, it combines that sort of clippedness that you get from 1930s dialogue. Has a bit of that at moments when they're kind of sparring between because what it does in the film, which I think is a really interesting way of adapting it, is they boil it down like Hammer did, and boil it down to a sense that we're now living in the Seward madhouse in this film. We're literally in it all the time. So the fact that there's no escape anymore. These families are ingrown. Harker is not necessarily a great choice for Lucy rather than Mina, because they do switch around, which is also something that Hammer did as well. So now we find that actually these women don't have great choices in front of them, and the fact that it is set around the idea of suffrage, women's suffrage, I think again links back to this idea of, here's this guy who comes along, very sexy, very attractive, foreigner, but sounds more American than English, but that's okay. And he offers me a choice, and the choice is not necessarily that I'm free from patriarchy, but the choice is that I have a choice, as opposed to this sort of predestined, scolded way that the women are treated by Dr. Seward and even by Harker to a degree. So we find that actually he is the liberated choice. He is the 70s women's liberation choice. You want to have the sexy guy with whom it may or may not work out, but that's not the point. The point is you want to have the runaway experience with him. And that is what I think the film is really tapping into, is that 70s sexual desire and freedom, that women begin to have those conversations around their own understanding of their own sexual drive and desire. That sounds really late, I appreciate, but actually it is true. If you look back on the sort of period, you know, in which women are beginning to have those conversations that would have been seen as incredibly impolite and incredibly improper only decades earlier. So now it's not about keeping it under wraps or under the lid. It's actually now saying you can have these desires, and I will not only realize them, but I'll help you fulfill them in a way that goes absolutely counter to anything else that's going on in the culture. I think that's really exciting. So Langella really uses that magnetism in order to sell that to the audience and of course to the characters. So it's not as, it's a different form of danger than you get with Lugosi. Lugosi is a danger because he's an outsider, because he's an unknowable thing, because he's not part of the culture. He's always going to be untamable. Lee is a very different form of danger because he's something that's unstoppable even by patriarchy. Patriarchy can't get him or barely controls him. But Langella's one is the one that seduces from within. I'll give you what you want and you'll betray them yourself. And that's game, set and match, you know, in terms of now we have a Dracula that actually fully understands the true nature of his power. If you get the women on side, then there's no way that they'll ever go back to these outgrown, stale, male controlled spaces.
And there's a lot more attention placed in this version on the female characters, even though they're sort of switched around weirdly, but and kind of their devotion, their choice to be devoted to Dracula both before and after they're actually bitten. So what do you think about, you know, sort of describe this alluring seduction that this long form seduction that he does with them, but what do you think this Dracula's take is on its female characters?
I think it genuinely is trying to situate them within the discourse of second wave feminism, honestly, reading it like that, because they are talking about it opens with them talking about Mina and Lucy talking about how they're not chattel. They're, you know, they have a right to vote, they have a right to their own opinions, that it shouldn't just be men who have the vote, that kind of thing. That's a very, very hyper political statement coming out of a Universal horror film at that time. So it is very much showing that awareness, demonstrating that awareness. But these women, they have their own desire. And what I love about this film is that Lucy, while she's scolded and told that and treated like a child in ways that I find rather infuriating watching it, what's great about it is that she gets to have the choice. Her desires and her choices matter more than anything around the sort of male benefactors around her. She gets to basically tell Jonathan, nope, you know, I know what I'm doing here, you don't know anything. Van Helsing's revealed to be incredibly weak and compromised, and as same with her, with Dr. Seward, her father. So what you find is that she's actually the only one who's able to enable Dracula to survive, depending on how you read the ending, Anna, because I know a lot of people have there's two readings of that ending, and I have a very, I think, sunny outlook on it, which is that he survives and she enables that survival. That survival might not necessarily mean that he's going to completely make it back to Romania, but he survives the encounter to live again, whereas other people have read it quite differently. So
I mean, I've also read it like that, and actually I was quite surprised by the ending, because it's essentially a hopeful ending for the monster of the film. And I find it very interesting that it kind of, even though Dracula is the monster, he is much more than in any of the other versions, quite a sympathetic, romantic, almost cursed hero. He's obviously menacing and manipulative, and he is an undead being, but he maybe this is the Langella effect, maybe it's those big brown eyes, but he does seduce us into being on his side.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, as I say, like initially you kind of think, oh, okay, he's attractive, but he's a bit strange or he's a bit creepy. And when you see Mina's been transformed, you kind of, when we come across her, we're like, oh, well, that's a bit grisly. But in comparison with, as I say, that ingrown Hammer family that she is surrounded by, he is so the better choice. And I think it's really, the film is in love with him from the outset. There's this really striking moment when they eventually consummate their relationship and the whole screen glows red. and I mean glows red. It's such a striking moment, because in a film that looks largely, or certainly early versions of it, look quite desaturated. It looked really bled out of color, as though it tried to look like a black and white film, but not really. And I know that when they were making it, Badham wanted to make it in black and white, and Universal told him no way. The fact that then we have this gorgeous glowing siren red shot where the two of them are essentially kissing, and then it goes into this really interesting tilt. What you find is that you're like, this is really sexy without having to show a lot of flesh. This is really, really erotic without having to titillate in any kind of 70s pornographic way. This is very much about getting a sense of the sensuality behind it, and that's what works really, really well for this.
I mean, I was about to ask you about that scene, so thank you for bringing it up. And obviously, I am going to drag it into the gutter, because that is 100% a sex scene. And
oh, yeah, for sure.
That is how it's bookended, by Langella flying in through the window with his shirt open, which is the first time he has a shirt open, with the cape still on. And sort of flying in through the window and basically declaring that he's going to take Lucy, and they kiss. But there's also quite not a sweet, but there's an element of him making sure that there is consent. Like, it's extremely consensual. It's not violent. Like, she's been waiting for him.
She's sitting there going, oh my God, he's finally here. This is great, And as of the audience kind of going, come on, let's get together. I think it's it's nothing like the earlier Draculas, where you feel, if you were thinking about something like consent or whatever else, and I mean, vampires and consent, regrettably, for one reason or another, is a very recent thing. But you do see that in the 70s, there is more of this idea of, do you desire what I offer you? Yes. And I think in this, you really do see that. Whereas in the earlier ones, women were still transactional victims one way or the other, or hypnotized or abandoned. Whereas with the 70s, it's actually about, if you want it, you can have it.
Yes, and I found this scene in particular, I mean, obviously it's this blast of color. I've just watched it this morning, and I screenshotted the hell out of it, because I was like, this is striking. It's just blood red, and these two, their silhouettes floating essentially in blood space. And then there's a bat flying towards the camera, which is a sweet little harkening back as well to the... It's a sex scene, but it's also melding of them, and it's the two of them. It's not Dracula just sucking the blood out of this woman. It's the two of them intertwined, which absolutely elevates the romance of this take on Dracula, and the fact even that he refers to Lucy as my queen later on. Like, she's not one of the couple of brides of Dracula that he has essentially as his minions that are completely under his control. There is an element of, this is a romantic gothic drama, as opposed to, she's just another girl I'm just gonna transform and then put her in a coffin and forget about her and go into the next one. And I guess that's the flowery nature of this adaptation, but it did take me by surprise, because it's extremely erotic, and there's a lot of emphasis, I think, placed on how she's feeling and how she's experiencing this moment. And there's a previous scene where they have their first kiss, and they spend so long on that. It almost reminded me of this is a very strange comparison, because I know that in that film they weren't allowed to show a kiss that was longer than X amount of seconds, but in Notorious, and they just spent a very, very long time on a dialogue scene between Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman, and I think it's Ingrid Bergman, and they were just talking with their mouths really close to one another, and it's you just get like 4 minutes of them essentially talking into each other's mouths, and it's so sexy.
It's always about that idea of the unrealized, isn't it? I mean, it reminds me, actually, funnily enough, again, keeping it in vampires, but in a different kind of way. When you look at Neil Jordan's Into the Vampire, you have this great moment towards the end where you have Louis and Normand having this exchange, which always, in that whole scene, no matter how many times I watch it, but because of the proxemics of it, it looks like they're going to kiss. Of course they're going to kiss. They're going to kiss. They are millimeters from each other's mouths. And then it breaks away. So you're like, oh, it's about that rubbing up against that frisson with the forbidden. And that forbidden could be anything. It could be something much more conservative in the 70s, or indeed the idea of capturing a gay kiss in the 1990s, but in a Hollywood production. But what I think is really interesting about it in the case of the Langella Dracula is that red, of course, symbolizes yes, blood and everything, but it's also passion.
Yes.
And this is it. There's passion here. It's not red as danger. It's red as passion, enveloping sexual desire. This is really powerful stuff. And I know for all of people watching it going, oh God, the 70s haircuts, the 70s lapels, all the rest of it, I dare you not to feel a little bit turned on by the end of it, because it is really vivid and really earnest. You know, you really feel that they're selling it to you. And I think that, as I say, if you encounter that at exactly the right age, that would be quite a profound effect, I think it would have on you.
I mean, not going to lie, at any age.
Well, you're still in the afterglow, I think. You're in the afterglow. I've seen it many, many, many times, so I'm like, yeah, it's wonderful.
I'm in the Langella afterglow where I just texted all of my friends being like, you cannot believe what I have just seen. It is the cure for everything. This has cured my entire life. I have no more problems anymore.
Well, I'll tell you this now, and I know we talked about it before, but when Langella was invited to Dublin in 2018 for a film festival, and I flew into Dublin a day early because he was going to be there. And I managed to, anyway, get to this Q&A session, and he was talking about his life and his career and his book at the time. And I have to tell you, after having a very brief question and conversation with him, I mean, the man is at least, I'd say, 82, 83 at that point. But both my mother and I just thought, he is so seductive. He still has it. He still has those beautiful big brown eyes, but it's his voice. It's a bit like Christopher Lee as well. That voice is disarmingly charming. It's quite something. He has still got it. Without question.
I really hope I never meet him after watching this film. This whole series is just going to be just a whole bunch of thirsting after vampires. That's all it's going to be.
I think so. I think that's going to be brilliant. It'll knock it out of the park. How do we not love them?
And to start wrapping up our conversation and to bring all of these three films together, what do you think kind of the evolution of Dracula as a cinematic monster, but also as a romantic hero has been?
I think when you're thinking about the going from the official Dracula, I suppose, of 1931, and how he's established himself as the character of Dracula as this outsider, but elegant, supernaturally inflected, capable of strange and wonderful things, and yet at the same time he's still having to deal with these pesky humans. I think that you see this evolutionary shift. Through the 50s and you gain the physicality, through the 70s you gain the political sensitivity, the desire to be really united with the long lost wife really comes to the fore in the 70s, although it has outlying influencers as well. By the 80s, Dracula goes into a complete coma. There is no Dracula films in the 80s at all, because it basically transfers to the youth. I mean, there are Dracula pops up in other films, but it's not his film. And then we find, by the time we get to the 90s, it's romanticized entirely. Coppola's Dracula is a love letter to all Draculas of the 20th century, pretty much, as well as the screen technologies that inform Dracula's evolution. So when we get to more recent ones then, like Dracula Untold, Dracula 2000, Dracula Untold, and Dracula, the BBC version this year, we're seeing a play on origins and a rewriting around the story, and that's quite common. Over any other character, I think, in Gothic literature, Dracula has been not only adapted and written, but rewritten in numerous ways. So he's always being shifted and changed and put into new scenarios whereby he has to grapple with the contemporary world. The good thing about the Dracula adaptation that came out this year was that they recognized the fact that it was very, very crowded with male characters who did all the action. The women were sort of either used or discarded in the original novel, serving a particular purpose, but never necessarily finishing it out. And I think that they're trying to change that by shifting it to minor characters that were always written out of Dracula. I'm thinking of Sister Agnes, for instance. So you have these interesting adaptations that change. But the Dracula himself, Dracula in the BBC version, I think he was rather unchanging in the sense that he wasn't very sympathetic, and he was very much about, well, I'm just going to stick around and time is on my side. I never really felt the need for him to he never had the depth that I wanted him to have. I think it was more about putting him into different situations. He's up to date, but I didn't necessarily find him to be as compelling to watch on screen. It was more about how they were going to try and transform the postmodern world around him, rather than necessarily have him come to the fore. Yeah, he's slick and he's adaptable and changeable, but I never felt that he was... Why is he here? That's what I really wanted to get to the crux of, and I don't think I ever got that answer. Dracula Untold, it's got an obvious debt, of course, to Coppola. But I also think that Dracula Untold was also about trying to fill in that narrative gap we talked about earlier. What made Dracula into the person that he is? Well, actually, it's more scary to think about that he didn't need a reason. That actually he just is. And I know Coppola did that with the opening and ending of his film. But the idea is we're always trying to give Dracula a story. We're always trying to superimpose a narrative on him. And that brings it up to date for readers and listeners. But at the same time, I think we have to think about the second we do that, we're trying to humanize a character that, unlike a lot of other vampires, Dracula isn't that human. He has a different impulse, a different drive, a different urge. He isn't really that human. When he is transformed, he becomes something else. Whereas vampires, more traditional humans that are turned into vampires, ones that are not Dracula, they tend to have these sympathetic streaks that we can relate to much better, like Louis in Into the Vampire. We find this, or David in The Lost Boys, we find this something much more emotionally connected with them, I think, than with Dracula. Dracula is still that strange other. So, I don't know. He's changed a lot, but at the same time, because he's got that name, because that name is branded, they have to keep in touch with certain rules. Certain rules have to be precise throughout, whether that is that he's older, that he's refined or sophisticated in some way. Even if it is that he keeps the tuxedo and dress, that's fine. They haven't kept the widow's peak in all cases, thank goodness. So there's ways in which the authority of the name Dracula, that tends to stick. One thing I've noticed, even in Dracula adaptations that aren't so great, like for example Dracula 2000, this is not so good. But I will say one thing, when it's revealed, and I won't say who, but when it's revealed who he is in history, at least that's got gravitas to it. You can kind of go, okay, for a film that maybe doesn't sell its ideas very well, that is a very good core hook. And that hook works. So there is a gravitas to the name Dracula. You don't throw it around. So this is why I'm saying there are vampires and then there are Draculas. So there's subtleness. There's a subtlety between them, and that subtlety makes all the difference of how you recognize generic vampires from Draculas. So you got to have the gravitas to get the name Dracula, I think.
And do you think that Dracula is inherently an evil character?
I think he can be. I don't think he always is. I think it's a point of view. And that's my own prejudice on this, because I've always been fascinated by the vampire's point of view. If you're thinking about it in terms of, people being treated as disposable, a desire for power, a tyrannical thirst, a desire for knowledge and to conquer the world, well, yes, I don't think anyone wants to live in a world or a time where we feel that's very close by. But when you look at it from the inverse, he's an outsider. He's vulnerable, and his vulnerabilities are exploited once they're discovered. He very well may stand in for issues around post-colonialism, issues around racism, issues around insecurity, the modern world catching up with and destroying his folkloric sense of himself and his homeland. So there are these interesting ideas that are always in battle. So I don't think he's fully evil. He is in the novel. I think it's much more explicit in the novel. But in the adaptations we've come across, I think what we discover is that there's a little bit of Dracula that we all identify with and that we all have sympathy for. And then it's just a question of degrees after that. How much of it then we're willing to to be seduced by, and what is it that we admire in him or desire in him. So every Dracula is a little bit different, and therefore I think that's why certain versions speak to certain people of certain ages over others.
I love that. And to wrap up, what is your own personal favorite take on Dracula?
I gotta go with the classic here. Gotta go with Coppola from 1992, and I think it's because of two reasons. Number one, I am eternally in love with Gary Oldman. He could read a phone book and I would be there. He's just there's something very mesmeric about him as a character, as an actor. But also, I saw it at exactly the right age. I saw it when I was 12. I stayed up late to watch it. It was on, God, I can't remember what channel it was on. But I saw it when I was 12 or 13, because I'm just thinking when it would have been on TV. But what was really exciting about it was that MTV at the time used to run this campaign where you could win a trip to Bran Castle in Romania.
No,
And
you didn't.
Oh yeah.
No,
I still remember I mean, I didn't win it. I was 12. But my point is, I still remember the advertising campaign for that competition, which it tied into the movie, because it blew my mind that A, this film looked amazing and forbidden and all the rest of it, and gory and sexy and everything I want to see. But B, that there was a place in the world where you could actually go and there was a Castle Dracula. I'm there. So it blew my mind. Since then, I mean, it had a very profound effect on me, because since then I'd watched documentaries where people were, scholars of Dracula. There was there was an order of Dracula. I was like, holy crap, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So it had a very profound importance on me, because it hit at exactly the right moment for my 12/13-year-old brain to go, well, that's what I want to be doing.
I love
so
it.
Kids, you can do this. You can grow up to do and talk about and read and write about exactly what you love. It is entirely possible, because I've done it for myself with vampires. So, but Coppola's Dracula, that's the one that stays with me. It's the one, no matter how many times students tell me, oh, it looks old-fashioned, that's the one. That's the one that seduces me every time.
I love it. Serka, thank you so much for all of your time and your incredible insight. Where can people find more of your work online?
So online you can, if you ask Santa, he might be very nice to you. There's a book called Postmodern Vampires, film, fiction and popular culture, which I brought out last year, on vampires and vampire adaptation and popular culture from 1968 to pretty much ending with What We Do in the Shadows. You can find that on all good bookshops and online sellers. You can also find, I've got numerous articles out there on vampires and all sorts of variations thereof. I just have a book as well coming out with the British Library, co-edited with my colleague Xavier Aldana Reyes, where we look at vampire short fiction. It's called Visions of the Vampire, and you can get it from the British Library bookshop. And again, that's a really nice one if you want to give the gothic person in your life something nice for their stocking. So yes, that's available there as well.
It looks gorgeous. I've already put it on my wish list.
It's very pretty. I'm not going to lie to you. The British Library did a beautiful job. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of the Final Ghost podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your shows. If you can, please do take the time to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help a lot. You can find out more about what we do on thefinalghost.co.uk. Subscribe to Bloody Women, which we send out every week with newly commissioned writing, and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Final Ghost UK. You can also follow Serka on Twitter at Vampire Serka. That's spelled SORCHA. And I am at Anna B. Demented. Thank you for listening. And next week, Pamela Hutchinson will be joining me to discuss the bootleg Dracula, Nosferatu, and Werner Herzog's remake of the film from 1979.